Hello everyone. Today's quick workshop is going to be all about teaching vocabulary. In this case, we're going to be looking specifically at SLE because it is different to PIP and the more academic programs. Here we're going to look at, particularly with the new books coming out, how do we introduce vocabulary, what's the purpose, and how do we concept check it. Concept checking very important because there's no point learning vocabulary if you don't practice it and show any kind of understanding of it. Okay, so that's what we'll be looking at. So why is vocabulary so important? We know that students previously have studied these great vocabulary lists, but the problem with this is it's complete translation. English being the vast language that it is, you can't really understand vocabulary until it's in context because, like lots of other languages, many words can have multiple meanings. So the first thing we have to think about is the topic and the context, which is all our books are designed that way. We have a certain focus of the lesson, we're talking about sport or travel or science, whatever it is, and then we learn the vocabulary that makes sense. Okay, most of the new language actually that you will introduce in these courses will be vocabulary, as a lot of the grammar will already be known, if not completely sure how to use it, and so appropriate English, and in that case vocabulary becomes very important. Okay, and as at each level more and more appropriate vocabulary will be introduced. By the time we get to 3C advanced, we're now hoping that they can understand and use native nuances, okay, that you wouldn't study at lower levels. Okay, so with SLE, those of you who've taught the old books will know there was this tendency to introduce quite a lot of vocabulary in those lessons. In the new level 2 and also the new level 1 that'll be coming out soon, we need to think about what is important for our class. Okay, so which words before you go in as part of your lesson planning do you know are essential? It won't be everything, but there will be certain words that to do these activities properly you'll need to know. So it's a good idea to do that. Go to the activities that you're going to use, which of the words that you think are there or will come up are necessary. And this will help you avoid sort of coming up with a great list of words, new unknown words. It becomes too long. Or if we try to teach everything before we get to an activity, then we know it's gotten too far. In a 50-minute class, I consider personally 10 to 15 to be more than enough. Okay, it's not always possible to know exactly what will come up. There will be certain words, but it's up to you as a teacher to decide how relevant they will be to the lesson. Does the whole class need to know them? Or maybe it's just an individual student who needs to know that word. Okay, also if we have too many words that are being introduced or maybe on the board, it's impossible to concept check them in the time that you have. And if students get a lot of new and difficult words and the teacher hasn't planned, how they're going to teach them, students might translate, but often they will not retain the new words. So that short but very useful list of vocabulary, very good. So if we look at a typical SLE class, you'll either be doing 50-minute classes every day, or you split your lessons over 100 minutes every other day. So when should you teach the vocabulary? So there are different times. There are different times when it might be important, depending on the time you have and the number of activities you want to do. So often many teachers like to teach the vocabulary following the warm-up. Very useful when you have a short amount of vocabulary to introduce. Maybe it's actually just categories of vocabulary. So if we were talking about technology, we might split it down into, okay, the words today are auto technology and telephonic technology, whatever it is, if you think something that you can get done quickly. However, with each activity, there might be a few words that come up, and then you need to make sure as much as possible that essential vocabulary for that activity is taught before the activity, or you will end up going from group to group, re-explaining or stopping the activity to explain something that was essential. Of course, you can't always guard against that happening occasionally, but it should only be occasionally, not the norm. Okay, in corrections and feedback, often you'll hear, students need to know this better word, they keep saying this one, and I know really this is more native or this is more appropriate. And again, if you hear words that are inappropriate, then of course you can bring those out in the feedback. Definitely not at the end of the class, because if you're introducing anything new right at the end, it won't be practiced, it won't be retained. Concept checking, a word that I write a lot on feedback forms. Okay, what is it to concept check? Simply to make sure the students have understood what has been taught, not necessarily all of it, but we certainly hope the majority. With vocabulary, it's not as simple as just introducing it and hoping that they'll learn it, because that would be the same as you in any subject you studied at school. In science, in maths, if just one time it was brought up and then forgotten about. Well, then of course it would be forgotten about. Okay, so it's important that they practice it. If the teacher wastes a lot of the class time on vocabulary but then doesn't actually check if the students know what it means or how to use it, then all we've done is waste time. Okay, and the SLE books will include vocabulary in assessment checklists. Okay, so towards the back of the books, the reviews, or even in every lesson, you might want to bring it up. You know, at the end of the book, it will say students should know these kind of topics and vocabulary associated with these topics, and if they haven't learned that, they shouldn't really progress to the next level. Different ways then that you as a teacher could introduce vocabulary, and from this list is just a selection. You wouldn't rely on a single method of doing it, because if you always do it in the same way, you'll make your job very difficult, because for example there are some words that defy a simple definition. Okay, so you'll mix it up over time, you'll find different ways of doing it. These can be both presentations, or they could be activities that you give to the students to do, because of course you have to rely on, there will be some prior knowledge of vocabulary, and you don't want to waste a lot of time introducing everything when they might know 80% of it. So first of all, yes, definitions. Make sure these are simple and clear. Have you thought about the easiest way? Are you using any words in your definition that are more difficult than the original word? You know, can you describe it? Okay, a lot of the time definitions are difficult, but we can sort of talk about what it is, what it looks like, what it does, for example. A great vocabulary builders, you know, synonyms, antonyms for verbs and adjectives, similar, opposite words. Can I use visuals? I've got my smartphone, I've got Wi-Fi everywhere, you know, is there something in the book that I can use? You know, they will try and put things in to make it clearer. When can I act out? Can I use demonstration? Can I get the other students up, you know, doing something with me? Listening and text, of course, are wonderful ways of introducing vocabulary, because they will always be in context. And then, you know, associated ideas, you know, sometimes it might be you're trying to teach something like to be stressed out, and students get very confused about to stress, to get out your stress or to relieve your stress. So, you know, coming up with other ideas, you know, to be so angry, to be depressed, whatever it is, to make it clear. Translation can work, but the problem is, unless you're completely fluent, how do you know they're looking at the right meaning? Okay, so mix up your methods of how you're doing this. Okay, it's been presented. Now we have to concept check, as I said. How do we make sure that they use it? First of all, it might be something that you do in the book, or you might do this as a group, or you might create your own questions that use the vocabulary. So in order to answer the question, they need to understand the words there. Also, you encourage them to use the vocabulary in their answers. Students put the words into situations and context, so a lot of this would be lower on. It says like things like personalization, or they might have to tell a story or describe a picture, where the vocabulary would be the most obvious way of describing it. Are they using it? You can listen out for this. Charts, graphs, scales, pictures, you know, if you're trying to teach nuances between certain words, like, you know, tiny, small, wee, whatever it was, and they have to put things in order. Okay, personalization is usually the most useful. You know, instead of asking what does something mean, you ask when did you feel this, or when did something like this happen to you, and getting them to come up with those antonyms and synonyms, getting them to compare things. Okay, but it's important that they do get this kind of practice, even if it's short, as long as you're happy that they have a good understanding. Some concept checking that really isn't concept checking, but can be overused, particularly in SLE classes. The hideous question, do you understand? Or it's cleverly disguised cousins. Does that make sense? Are you following me? You're asking the students just to say yes or no. And often they'll say yes. Okay, can you put that in a sentence? It's a very odd thing to say without a topic or a very clear activity. Give them an activity that, you know, more or less forces them in a kind way to use it. So it's better to say, if we're studying, let's say, different feelings and emotions, I might give them pictures, different happy face, smiley face, depressed face, confused face, and I say, okay, I want you to describe the person. How are they feeling? Rather than can you just create a random sentence. Also, as well, you know, try to use these in conversation. You know, you're asking them at some point over the next 45 minutes, try and see if you can use something. Well, no, there has to be a more focused practice. Can anyone tell me what this means? Okay, a very difficult definition exercise. Where we use vague or confusing explanations, you know, it's about this or that, or also this, and sometimes means this, in this context, in this context, in this context. No, what is the concept of this class? What is the topic? Or I'm just simply going to explain these 25 words for you now, and 15 minutes later we might practice them, if you're lucky. So in review then, how can we make vocabulary teaching brief, simple, and meaningful? First of all, choose the essential vocabulary, plan how you will teach it. Of course, other words will come up, but they shouldn't be the majority of what happens. A board full of words is words that don't get learned. Okay, so choose it, plan it, look to the activities, look to the discussion. Okay, use a variety of methods, the way in which you introduce it. Do you need to introduce everything at the same time, or can you do it bit by bit? This avoids, the first 15, 20 minutes of the lesson only being about vocabulary. Okay, make sure there are practices. Look in the book. Is there a good practice there? Can you adapt a little bit? Maybe you're going to bring something in, even though the level might be the same, the students' levels can sort of differ. What do they need? And you need that practice to assess how well they're understanding. And make sure to review vocabulary. If we only look at something once in a month and we don't ever come back to it, it's easy to forget again. We've all done that. Tip of my tongue, tip of my tongue. Okay, thanks for listening to this. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.